The wind of Kaban carried dust across the wooden streets that morning when Sheriff Daniel Hayes first saw her. The town was quiet, only the sound of horses and the squeak of a hanging sign above the saloon. She was sitting near the water trough beside the post office, her back bent, her dark hair tangled, her eyes lost somewhere far away. People passed by her like she was invisible. Some glanced, others whispered, but no one stopped. To them, she was just another Apache woman, one of those who didn't belong here. Her name was Naya. In her tribe, she once had a place, a voice, and a future. She used to sing with the other women by the fire, weaving baskets and telling stories of their ancestors. But when years passed and she bore no child, whispers began to follow her like a shadow. The old women turned their faces when she came near. The younger ones spoke softly but sharply, words filled with pity. Even the men of her tribe stopped meeting her eyes. A woman who cannot bring life brings sorrow, they said. It started with silence, fewer smiles, fewer greetings. Then came distance. No one wanted to share food with her. No one wanted her to bless their children. Even her own sister stopped visiting. The tribe's healer told her she was touched by emptiness. That word cut deeper than any knife. It followed her into her dreams. One day she woke up to find her hut's door broken, her few belongings thrown outside. Her people stood in a line, faces painted for a festival. The elder of the tribe stepped forward and told her she had to leave. He did not shout. His voice was calm, almost sad. "You carry no seed," he said, "and no spirit of life will follow where you walk. You must go." She wanted to cry out, but her voice failed her. She wanted to ask why kindness had to depend on what she could give, but there was no one to listen. So she left. The mountains watched her go, and the wind seemed to whisper her name, Naya, Naya, as though trying to comfort her. For days she wandered across the dry land with no food, no water, and no hope. Her feet cracked, her lips burned, and her eyes could no longer see straight. She followed the sun by day and the stars by night, until her body could no longer carry her. When she finally reached Kaban, she had nothing left but breath. That was where Sheriff Daniel found her. He was a quiet man, not one to speak much or show what he felt. He had been a soldier once, had seen too many things men should never see. Now he kept peace in a dusty town that never really knew what peace meant. When he saw the woman by the trough, her head low and her skin pale from sun and hunger, he did not think twice. He lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing and carried her through the silent street. People stared. Some laughed quietly, others shook their heads. "Sheriff's gone soft," one man muttered. Daniel ignored them. He carried her to a small house behind the jailhouse, laid her on his own bed and fetched water. Her pulse was weak, her skin hot with fever. For 3 nights he watched over her, giving her small sips of water and spoonfuls of soup. On the 4th morning she opened her eyes. She looked around in confusion, her gaze falling on the man by the table. He was sharpening his knife slowly, the sound of stone against metal steady and calm. He turned his head slightly. "You're safe," he said. His voice was low and even. "You're in Kaban." She didn't answer. Her throat hurt and she didn't trust her voice. He handed her a cup of water. "Drink," he said, and she obeyed. It was the first kindness she had received in months. Days turned into weeks and she began to recover. Though she spoke little, Daniel noticed small things about her. The way she folded her blanket each morning with care. The way she stepped outside at dawn to face the rising sun and whisper words he didn't understand. Once he asked her what she said every morning. "I greet the sky," she replied softly. "It is the only one that never turned away." He nodded, not knowing how to answer that. "What's your name?" he asked one evening as he fixed the old door. "Naya," she said after a long pause. "That's a good name," he replied simply, and went back to his work. But not everyone in Kaban shared his calm. The townsfolk began to talk. They didn't like the idea of their sheriff bringing a stranger, an Apache woman, into his home. The storekeeper refused to serve her. The preacher crossed the street when she walked by. Even the children threw pebbles and called her names. Naya said nothing. She had faced worse, but Daniel saw the pain in her eyes, the quiet way she lowered her head when someone spat near her feet. One afternoon, he walked into the saloon, slammed his badge on the counter, and spoke loud enough for every man there to hear. "The law protects everyone in this town," he said. "If anyone harms or insults the woman under my roof, they'll answer to me." His tone was calm, but his eyes were like steel. No one said a word. After that, the whispers died down. That night, Naya tried to leave. She packed her small bundle and waited for the moonlight to fade. But before she could step out, Daniel was already there, leaning against the doorway. "Where are you going?" he asked. "You've done enough," she said quietly. "They will hate you because of me." He looked at her for a long moment. "Let them," he said finally. "I've seen hate before. It burns out faster than kindness." She lowered her eyes. "You don't understand. I bring no luck. I was cast out because I could not give life." He took a step closer. "You're still alive," he said. "That's enough for now." For the first time, she felt something shift inside her chest. She stayed. Days grew warmer. She began to cook simple meals, wash clothes, and care for his horse, a gray stallion named Blue. Daniel didn't say much, but he noticed the peace that filled the house. The silence that once felt heavy now felt like rest. One morning he found her sitting on the porch, her hair catching the sunlight. She was carving something from a piece of wood, a small bird. When she saw him watching, she smiled shyly. It was the first smile he had seen from her. "In my tribe," she said, "we carve birds for those we thank." He looked at the tiny wooden figure and nodded. "Then I'm honored," he said. But behind her calm eyes, Naya still feared the world beyond that porch. She knew how fast peace could break. She often dreamed of her tribe, of the faces that turned away. Sometimes she woke in the night, whispering words of forgiveness to people who would never hear them. Daniel never asked. He just brought her a blanket and sat nearby until she fell asleep again. By the time spring came, the town began to see her differently. They noticed the clean flowers near the sheriff's gate, the soft singing that came from his porch at night. Some even stopped to listen. Others began to greet her by name. The children who once threw stones now asked her to tell stories about eagles and rivers. She told them with gentle words, her eyes warm, and yet deep down she wondered if she truly belonged. Could someone who had lost her place ever find a new one? She didn't have the answer. But every time Daniel returned from his long rides and left his hat by the door, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that needed words or promises. It was the quiet kind that filled the air between two people who understood pain, but chose kindness anyway. And though she didn't know what the future held, she knew one thing. For the first time since her exile, she wasn't walking alone anymore. Weeks passed, and life in the small desert town of Kaban slowly began to change. The sheriff's home, once quiet and filled only with the creak of floorboards and the sound of wind, now carried a softer warmth. The smell of bread, stew, and fresh herbs lingered in the air. Naya had planted a small patch of green near the porch, using seeds she found near the creek. She tended to them each morning, her fingers gentle on the soil. The townsfolk who once avoided walking near the sheriff's place sometimes paused to watch her. They didn't speak, but their eyes were different now, less cold, more curious. Daniel noticed these changes too. He had spent most of his life dealing with trouble, bandits, drunk fights, and broken men, but never had he felt peace the way he did now. Naya didn't speak much, but her silence wasn't heavy. It was calm. When she hummed softly while cooking, he'd find himself listening without meaning to. Sometimes, when he came home late from patrol, she'd leave a small plate covered by a cloth on the table. It was a simple act, but it made the house feel alive again. One afternoon, a storm came rolling down from the northern hills. The sky turned dark and heavy, and the wind carried sand through the narrow streets. Thunder echoed off the cliffs, and lightning flashed bright enough to light the rooftops. Naya stood by the window watching as the rain poured down, soaking the streets. In the distance, a loud crack of thunder was followed by a rising shout. Fire! Smoke rose from the deputy's barn at the edge of town. The roof had caught fire from the lightning. Without waiting, Daniel grabbed his coat and ran outside. Before he could reach for his horse, he saw Naya running ahead of him, her shawl pulled over her head. "Naya!" he shouted, but she didn't stop. She ran through the mud and wind straight toward the fire. Inside the barn, two children were crying, trapped behind fallen wood. Naya pushed through the smoke, her hands covering her mouth. She pulled one of the beams aside and reached for the smallest child, a boy who couldn't have been more than 6. She carried him out into the rain, coughing and shaking, then turned back in for the other. By the time Daniel reached her, she was dragging the second child out. Her clothes scorched at the edges, but her eyes steady. The deputy fell to his knees, clutching his children and thanking her over and over. Daniel stood beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "You could have been hurt," he said softly. She looked up at him through the rain. "I was already hurt before I came here," she said. "This is nothing." That night the storm passed, leaving behind the smell of wet earth. The whole town gathered outside the saloon to thank her. The same people who once whispered about her now spoke her name with respect. One man brought her a basket of bread. The storekeeper who once refused her service walked up awkwardly and handed her a jar of honey. "For your kindness," he said quietly. Daniel watched her smile, shy but real. He realized that something in Kaban had shifted that night. People saw not an Apache woman, but a person who had risked her life for their children. Days turned into weeks and peace settled over the town. Naya's herbs grew strong, and her laughter began to echo faintly from the sheriff's porch. Every morning, Daniel found her talking to the sky again, whispering in her native tongue. Once he asked what she said. She smiled and answered, "I thank the wind for letting me stay one more day." One evening, as the sun dipped behind the red hills, Daniel sat on the porch sharpening his knife as usual. Naya sat nearby, sewing a tear in his sleeve. After a long silence, he spoke. "Do you ever think about going back? To your tribe?" he asked carefully. She paused, her hands still. "They left me for empty," she said softly. "But here I am full again." He nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "You made this place better, Naya," he said. She looked at him and smiled. "You gave me a place to stand. I only planted what was already growing." Months later, news came from the mountains. A traveler rode into Kaban and told them a sickness had spread among the Apache villages. Many were dying and they had no medicine. The moment Naya heard it, she froze. Her hands trembled, but her eyes were firm. Daniel knew what she was thinking before she said a word. "I have to go," she said. "They are still my people." Without hesitation, Daniel saddled his horse and packed supplies. "Then I'm going with you," he said. They rode for hours across dry plains and rocky paths until they reached the foot of the hills. Smoke from campfires rose weakly against the setting sun. The once proud tribe was now quiet and broken. When they entered the camp, the elder who had once cast her out looked at her in shock. His face was thin, his eyes sunken. "You should not help us," he said, coughing. "We turned you away." Naya knelt beside him, offering water from her canteen. "You are still my people," she replied. "Even if you forgot me, I never forgot you." For days she worked tirelessly, using the herbs she had grown in Kaban to treat fevers and heal wounds. She moved from tent to tent, whispering prayers and comforting the sick. Daniel helped however he could, fetching water, lifting the weak, and keeping the fires burning through the cold nights. The tribe watched silently as she gave everything she had without asking for forgiveness or thanks. By the end of the week, the sickness began to fade. Children were laughing again, and old songs returned to the campfires. The elder called her to him one morning. His voice was weak, but his eyes were wet. "We were wrong," he said. "You were not empty. You brought life back to us." She smiled, her heart heavy yet light. "It was never my life alone to carry," she said gently. "It belongs to all who still choose kindness." When it was time to leave, the tribe gathered to see her off. They called her Mother of the Wind, the one who carried strength to the broken. Daniel looked at her with quiet pride. She had healed more than the sick. She had healed the pain of being forgotten. Back in Kaban, life returned to its quiet rhythm. The townsfolk greeted her warmly now, not out of pity but out of respect. Children came to her garden to learn about plants. Women visited her for advice. The sheriff's porch became a place of peace for everyone who passed by. One evening, as the sun set over the desert, Daniel stood beside her on the porch. He held a small carved bird in his hand, a rough figure he had made himself from cedar wood. "For you," he said. "You taught me something I didn't know I'd forgotten." She turned the carving over in her hands, smiling softly. "And what's that?" He looked at her, his eyes gentle. "That home isn't a place. It's a person." The air was warm, filled with the sound of crickets. Naya looked at the horizon where the sun melted into gold. "Home," she repeated quietly. "Yes, it's where someone chooses to keep you." That night, as lanterns flickered in the windows and the stars shone above the quiet town, the people of Kaban spoke of the woman who had once been cast out. They no longer called her infertile or cursed. They called her by her true name, Naya, the woman who healed a tribe, a town, and a man's heart without ever asking for anything in return. And in that dusty corner of the world where kindness was once rare, Her story became a quiet reminder that even a heart once broken can bring life again if someone chooses to believe in it.